The door handle moves on its own. You are watching it. You cannot look away. It turns slowly, deliberately, the way a hand turns it when someone on the other side is trying not to make a sound. You tell yourself it is the wind. You tell yourself it is the old house settling. You have been telling yourself things like that for 3 days now, and every single time you were wrong. The smell hits you first. Wet soil and something older than soil, something sweet and rotted and wrong. The smell of flowers left too long on a grave. It is seeping under the door now, filling the room, filling your lungs. You back toward the window. Your heel catches the edge of the bed and you nearly go down. Your hand finds the curtain and you pull it aside without thinking, because the window feels like escape and your brain is no longer interested in logic. She is already there, standing just beyond the glass, close enough that her breath would fog it if she still breathed. The white dress hangs off her like something forgotten. Her eyes are open. They have always been open. And she is looking directly at you. Not through you, not past you, at you. Like she has been waiting a very long time, and she has finally decided you are the one she has been waiting for. Harlan Cross had never been the type to believe in anything he could not photograph. He was 26 years old, trained as an architectural historian, and had spent the better part of 2 years driving through the rural South documenting structures that the rest of the world had quietly agreed to forget. Old churches, abandoned courthouses, plantation-era outbuildings slowly being swallowed by kudzu and time. He had a battered field notebook, a camera that had seen better decades, and a quiet obsession with the way old buildings held memory, the way grief and joy and violence pressed themselves into wood and stone like fingerprints that never fully faded. He arrived in Calder Hollow, Tennessee, in the second week of October. Calder Hollow was the kind of small town that still appeared on paper maps, but had stopped growing sometime around 1970, and had been slowly exhaling ever since. One main street, a gas station that doubled as a post office, a diner with a hand-painted sign, and on the far edge of town, set apart from everything else the way certain things are set apart, a white clapboard church surrounded by a cemetery that was old enough to have sections that predate the Civil War. Harlan rented a room from a woman named Ruth, who ran the only lodging in town, 3 rooms above her antique shop, cleaned meticulously and priced so low it almost felt like an apology. Harlan liked Calder Hollow immediately. It was quiet in a way that felt honest rather than empty. The leaves were turning. The air had that particular October weight to it, cool and heavy and slightly sweet. He set up his notebooks, charged his batteries, and told himself he would be there 2 weeks at most. On his first walk through the cemetery, he noticed the arch. It stood near the back corner, half covered in dead ivy, leaning slightly to the left as though it had meant to fall for years and had simply not gotten around to it. It was wrought iron, or matework, the kind no one bothered with anymore, and it straddled the oldest section of the cemetery, where the headstones were so worn the names had become suggestions rather than words. Harlan photographed it. He noted the design in his field book. He moved on. He did not think about it again until that night. The first sound came at 11:47 on a Wednesday. Harlan knew the exact time because he had glanced at his phone 30 seconds before, checking a reference he needed for his notes. He was sitting at the small desk in his room, window cracked to let in the night air, lamp on, the comfortable industry of a man absorbed in his own work. Then, footsteps. Not inside, outside, on the wooden porch that ran along the front of the building. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind that belong to someone who is not in a hurry because they are not worried about being heard. Harlan tilted his head, listened. Ruth turned in early. He had heard her door close hours ago. The street beyond the porch was empty. He could see that much through the window, the orange wash of the single streetlight painting nothing but pavement and fallen leaves. He told himself it was a neighbor, someone cutting through on the way home. The footsteps stopped directly outside his window. He looked. The porch was empty. He sat there for a moment, aware that his pulse had picked up for no good reason, then turned back to his notes. Old building, old porch boards, thermal expansion probably, wood contracting in the cold. Completely ordinary. He believed that. He almost completely believed that. The second sign came the following evening, and it was harder to explain. He had come back from a long afternoon at the church and cemetery, camera full, boots dirty, the pleasant exhaustion of good field work in his bones. He was washing up at the sink when he noticed something on the windowsill. A dried flower. A single bloom, a white rose, long dead, the petals the color and texture of old paper. He had not put it there. His window had been closed all day. He turned it over in his hands, studying it the way he studied everything, methodically, with the trained patience of someone who had learned that things only gave up their meaning to people willing to look long enough. It smelled like the cemetery, specifically, unmistakably, like the corner near that earn arch, that particular combination of old earth and something else he could not name, something that had no business being in a second-floor room with a closed window in the middle of the afternoon. Harlan set the flower down. He stood very still in the room for the fading light, the silence of the room feeling different, not empty, but occupied. Then he picked up his notebook and pretended to write. He went back to the cemetery that night. He knew, even as he was pulling on his jacket, that it was not a rational decision. He went anyway. It was the arch. He needed to understand the arch. Harlan had been trained to believe that buildings and structures held answers, that if you looked carefully enough, the physical record of a place would tell you what happened there. He had built a career on that belief. It had never failed him. He walked the empty main street, leaves skittering ahead of him in the dark, the church spire a black shape against a sky thick with clouds that kept swallowing the moon. The cemetery gate was unlocked. It was always unlocked. There was nothing in Calder Hollow worth stealing, Ruth had told him. Not anymore. He moved through the older section with his flashlight, past stones so ancient they had become part of the ground rather than markers above it. The arch was exactly where he had left it. But something was different. The ivy had moved. Not trimmed, moved. Pulled back from the center of the arch as though cleared by a deliberate hand, exposing the ironwork beneath. And on the ground, directly under the arch, the grass was pressed flat in an oval shape, approximately the size of a person standing still for a very long time. Harlan crouched and studied it. Fresh. The impression was recent, within hours, possibly within the last hour. He straightened up and swept his flashlight in a slow arc. He was alone. He stood under the arch. He should not have stood under the arch. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, suddenly, violently, the kind of cold that finds the back of your neck before anywhere else. His flashlight flickered. He tapped it against his palm, and it steadied, and in the moment between flicker and steady, he heard her. Not footsteps, not a voice, something between the two, a sound like fabric moving through air, like a long dress dragging across grass, circling him at the edge of his light. He turned again. The sound moved with him, always just behind the beam, always just outside what he could confirm. He left quickly. He told himself he had spooked himself, that the weather was weather, the sound was wind, the pressed grass was an animal. He listed these explanations in his mind like items on a receipt, checking them off one by one. He was halfway back to the lodging when he realized he was humming something. A melody. Slow, minor key, the kind of song that felt ancient the moment you heard it. He had no idea where it had come from. He had never heard it before in his life. He could not stop humming it. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to place the melody, and could not. He opened his laptop and tried to work, and could not. He lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. At 2:17 in the morning, the footsteps returned. This time, they did not stop at the window. They came up the stairs. Harlan sat up. The old staircase had a particular creak on the third step. He had learned it his first night, the way you learn the vocabulary of a strange house. He waited. Third step. Fourth. Fifth. They stopped outside his door. He did not move. He did not breathe. His hand found his phone on the nightstand, and he sat there in the dark holding it like it was something that could help him, knowing it could not, thinking about calling Ruth and then thinking about what he would say. There is someone on the landing. I heard them on the stairs. Except the footsteps had weighed almost nothing, had barely registered, as though whatever made them was only partly present in the physical world. The door handle moved, and Harlan Cross, who had never believed in anything he could not photograph, felt something he had no word for. Not fear exactly, but the predecessor to fear, the feeling you get in the half second before you understand what you are seeing. He stood up, took one step toward the door. It swung open. The landing beyond was empty. The hallway was dark. There was no one there. But the smell was there. Wet soil and old roses, thick enough to taste. And on the floor of the hallway, leading from the direction of the stairs towards his door and stopping just at the threshold, footprints, bare feet in damp soil, on a second-floor landing in a building he had not left all night. Ruth's face when he showed her the photographs the next morning told him everything before she spoke a word. She sat at her kitchen table with his phone in her hands and looked at the images of the footprints for a very long time. Then she set the phone down and folded her hands on the table and looked out the window at nothing. The story she told him was brief, and it was not the kind of story that left room for comfort. Her name had been Clara Voss. She had been 22 years old on the night of October 14th, 1904, which was the night she was supposed to become a wife. The ceremony had been set for the church, but the church that night was being used for a town meeting of some urgency, and so the wedding was moved to the cemetery grounds, beneath the iron arch that Clara's father had commissioned specially for the occasion. He had been a craftsman. He had been proud of that arch. The groom's name did not matter anymore, and Ruth did not offer it. What mattered was that he did not come. What mattered was that Clara waited for hours, standing under that arch in her dress, in the October cold, with the flowers in her hands going limp, her family standing back at a careful distance because no one knew what to say and no one was brave enough to say it anyway. She did not survive the night. What exactly happened was never fully settled. What was settled was that Clara Voss was buried 3 days later in the same cemetery, in the oldest section, within sight of the arch, and that within a year of her burial, people began to see something standing there on certain nights, a shape in white, standing very still under the arch, waiting. Ruth looked at Harlan and said something he did not understand at first. She said, "She does not appear to everyone. She has not shown herself in 11 years, not since the last person who got too close to that arch had to be persuaded to leave." Harlan asked what persuaded meant. Ruth was quiet for long enough that he stopped wanting to know. She asked him then if he had taken anything from the cemetery, any object, any material, any fragment of anything. Harlan remembered. The night of the first footsteps, he had reached out almost without thinking and touched the iron of the arch, and when he pulled his hand back, a small piece of the old dried ivy had come away with it. He had pocketed it reflexively. It was still in the jacket hanging by his door. Ruth's expression did not change, but her voice dropped to something very quiet. She said, "That is why she has come to you. She does not know you are a stranger. She only knows that someone has come back to the place where she waits, someone who carries a piece of it, and after 120 years of waiting, she has decided that is enough. He left the ivy on the kitchen table, and Ruth wrapped it in cloth without touching it directly and told him she would return it to the arch herself. She had done this before. She said it in the way people say things that have cost them something. Harlan packed in under 7 minutes. He had packed fast before, had learned how to do on years of field work where plans changed without warning, but he had never packed with the particular efficiency that comes from wanting to be somewhere else before the next sound from the staircase. He was carrying his bag to his car when he noticed the melody again. He had not been aware of humming it, but there it was, low in his throat, the same slow minor key phrase, the one with no name and no origin he could identify, and the moment he became aware of it, he stopped, standing in the cold morning air beside his car, listening to the silence that replaced it. He looked back at the church at the far end of the street, at the cemetery beyond it. He could not see the arch from where he stood, but he knew where it was. He could have pointed to it with his eyes closed. He thought about Clara Voss, 22 years old in a white dress under an iron arch, holding flowers that were going limp in the cold, waiting for someone who was already gone. He thought about what that waiting becomes when it has no end, when the years pile on top of each other and the world changes around you and you cannot change with it because you are still standing in that one terrible moment, waiting for a thing that is never going to arrive. He thought about what that does to a person, what it might make them become. He got in his car. He drove north without stopping for almost 4 hours. The melody faded somewhere around the Kentucky state line, so gradually he could not have said exactly when it left, only that at some point he realized he was no longer carrying it, and that the silence inside his head felt different than it had, cleaner, though never quite as clean as it had been before Calder Hollow. He never went back. He looked up Clara Voss 3 months later from the safety of a university library in another state. He found her in a county death registry dated October 17, 1904. Cause of entry, exposure. Age, 22. Marital status listed in the careful handwriting of a county clerk who probably thought it was a formality. Unmarried. He closed the archive. He sat very still. He thought about the oval of pressed grass under the arch, the impression of someone standing in one place for a very, very long time. He thought about the dried flower on his windowsill, a white rose, the kind carried by brides, the flower he had left behind on his desk, the one he hadn't even thought about in the rush to leave. He pulled up his photos from Calder Hollow that night, months after the fact, going through them methodically like he went through everything. Church exterior, headstones, iron arch. He stopped on one image. He had taken it the first afternoon, a wide shot of the older section, establishing the layout, standard documentation practice. He had looked at it once at the time and moved on. He had not noticed the first time the shape at the very edge of the frame, far back, partially obscured by a headstone, the white of it almost lost in the flat afternoon light. A figure, standing very still under the arch, facing the arch. He had been alone in that cemetery. He had checked. He was certain. He closed his laptop and did not open it again that night. There is a particular kind of grief that does not move. Most grief moves, slowly, painfully, but it moves. It changes shape. It finds a way to exist alongside the living. But some grief gets fixed in place by something catastrophic, a betrayal, an abandonment, a cruelty so complete that the person it happens to cannot find a way forward, and so they simply stop. Stand still in that moment. Wait. We do not talk about that kind of grief enough, the grief that cannot finish, the wound that never closes because the thing that caused it never resolved, never apologized, never returned, never gave the injured party any kind of ending to move beyond. Clara Voss waited under that arch for one night in October 1904, and whatever she became after that, whatever that waiting turned into across 120 years of cold autumns and indifferent springs, she was still, at her core, a woman who had never been given an ending. Maybe that is the real horror of this story. Not the figure at the window, not the footprints on the floor, not even the melody that lodged itself in Harlan's head like something that belonged there. The real horror is what we become when we are not allowed to finish. When the thing we were waiting for never comes, and the world keeps moving, and we cannot move with it. When hope curdles, when love, left unanswered for long enough, becomes something that no longer resembles love at all. Harlan Cross still photographs old buildings. He still travels through the rural South with his field notebook and his camera. He still believes that structures hold memory. He does not photograph cemeteries anymore, and he has never, not once in the years since Calder Hollow, picked up any object from any site he visits. Not a stone, not a leaf, not a fragment of anything. He does not explain this to people when they ask. He just says he learned to leave things where he found them. Some things have been waiting too long to be disturbed, and some of them have not given up on the idea that eventually someone will come back. That is what after the horror is. Not the moment the door opens. What was waiting on the other side, and how long it had been there. Sleep well, and if you hear something outside your window tonight, do not look.